Okay, good morning. We can start this session. Today we have the pleasure to have with us Kath Browne from University College of Dublin. Many thanks for being here. This is the fourth workshop on gender and sexuality in the EU, and the title of the session today is Considering Sexual and Gender Equalities and Legal Changes through the Experiences of Those Who Have Concern or Oppose Them. So it's a great opportunity for our course. I want to thank the BACES for hosting this conference. I will just give you a very brief sketches regarding Kath Browne biography, and then I let Kath speaking. Kath Browne is Professor of Geography at the University College of Dublin, and she has a Bachelor in Geography, Sports Science, Physical Education, a Master in Social and Cultural Geography, and a PhD on non-heterosexual women's everyday lives. Now, since 2014, she's a professor at the University College Dublin, the School of Geography. I went through her research interest. Her research interests lie in social and cultural geography, in particular people's spatial experiences of sexualities and gender. Kath's work has focused on the impact of legislative changes to sexual and gender equality in the 21st century. She's the lead investigator for a couple of very intriguing and interesting projects. I went through the webpage of one of these regarding anti-gender policies and discourse. So thanks for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to stand because I don't sit there. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you to Esther for all her work and the planning. The paper I was asked to write about was about EU integration, and I want to look at EU integration through questions of social cohesion and polarization. And apologies for the very long title. I've tried very hard to find a word that might describe this. So if anyone here is more artistic or creative than me, then I'll be grateful for your input. I also will examine human rights in ways that are often overlooked and at times necessarily sidelined, yet as the paper will show is key to understanding our contemporary gender and sexual landscapes. The paper is an outline of the book that we're writing from the Beyond Opposition Research, which is a European-funded project looking at how we might address polarization and specifically thinking about how we might live together when we cannot agree. So it will, for this, the provisional title of the book is Concerned Others. Again, we don't love it, but we can't think of anything better at the moment. A lot of what I will say at the outset shows this work in the context with other people. Just because of the kind of context of this and the content, it can be upsetting. If people are LGBTQIA+, have any experience of reproductive justice, if it's upsetting, please feel free to leave. What the people say is not, is not inclusive at times. So please mind yourself, as we would say in Ireland. In terms of social media, I'd appreciate if you didn't put this on social media. We're trying as much as possible not to be attacked and not to have different pylons to be able to do this research. So especially places like Twitter, and we can have a whole discussion about whether Twitter is useful or not at the end, but I would appreciate if it didn't go out there. But I'm more than happy to answer questions. I'm more than happy for you to email me afterwards to tell me your ideas, to tell me your thinking. So, social polarization is dividing Europe and beyond, creating a key issue for our time. And this is not just about racism and nationalism, although those are key. It's also about sexualities and genders, which have moved into a central position in both defining what constitutes European values, and also as a site of contestation and anti-EU challenges. Socio-legal changes, such as the advent of same-sex marriage, employment protections, gender recognition, and access to abortion, have defined the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And the places I'm going to look at today are Canada, Great Britain, and Ireland, which are not in the EU, in part because they were English-speaking, and we wanted to look at how things travelled transnationally. But I'd be really interested in what I hear about your course is that you are a transnational course yourself, how these things apply and don't apply in your contexts, and the ways these things might work or not work. It will be really, really interesting to talk about in the discussion. So polarizations around sexual and gendered lives, loves, politics, and activisms are not new. We face a contemporary moment built on historical oppressions where they are defining ways of life, political systems, and for some, our very existence. Divisions are fueled by those who feel that they are losing into rapid socio-legal changes around sexualities, genders, and abortions. And they are, in lots of ways, contesting what Weeks defined as the world we have won. So Weeks' term, the world we have won, will come up over and over again. This is the idea that with the advent of same-sex marriage, with the advent of reproductive rights, reproductive access, particularly in the UK, in 2007, he wrote a book called The World We Have Won. It's been heavily critiqued for all kinds of reasons, particularly the exclusions of the ways in which LGBTQIA+ people are not included in things like same-sex marriage, but also I'm critiquing it in this kind of creation of a winner-loser binary, because I feel that's really problematic. So until recently, research that explored oppositions to these changes beyond the US right or homophobic nations has been really limited. And one of the key contentions as a geographer is the place matters. So what often happens, and I'm sure this might never happen in Spain, but it always happens in the UK and Ireland, is they go, oh, it works like this in America, therefore it works like this everywhere. As a geographer, that's like the worst thing you can possibly say to us. So we were very, Catherine and I, when we started some of this work, were very critical of this idea that the US Christian right was just moving out, that it was just globalizing, and what we wanted to look at was how it applied in different places, and the places we chose were Ireland, the UK, and Canada. Similarly, the notion of homophobic nations is really, really problematic. It assumes that some places are winning and some places are losing. Some places are progressive, some places are backwards. And we really critiqued that. Niharika Banerjee and I critiqued that in the book called Livable Lives. But there is an increasing recognition that these resistances transnationally and nationally are happening. So Catherine Nash and I wrote the book Heteroactivism, which I'll come back to in a bit to discuss this, but the Pope called it anti-gender, and we have now this term anti-gender that circulates and explores those resistances to gender equalities and sexual equalities. And in the Resist project, where Maria Rodo de Sarta and myself are working on these anti-gender politics. So the EU sees these anti-gender politics as a really important part of how the contestations of democracy itself. So that's how these things are being looked at the moment. And I will show you the limits of this in a minute. So what I'm going to focus on then is these schisms, divisions, and polarizations. So divisions around sexualities, genders, and abortions are central, but they're often seen as a wedge issue in the US. So Emily Kazaki and I are exploring, we have an edited collection coming out around social polarization, around sexualities and genders. And what we say in the introduction of that is in the bulk of the political polarization literature, gender, sexuality, and abortion are seen as secondary to the main issue. So you've got the main issue, which is republicanism, or you've got the main issue, which is this kind of far-right discussion. So, but gender and sexuality are often relegated as useful political tools for creating polarization and ideological divisions, driving access to power and continuing control of nation states. But they're not seen as intersectional. They're wedges that drive other political agendas. They're not agendas in and of themselves. And also they're seen as potentially discardable if they become no longer useful. And of course, all of this is based in the USA, this discussion. Other areas are seen as bigger and more permanent. Catalyzing social divisions and debates around polarization can be dismissed then in favor of the real issues: political power, authoritarianism, and of course money. Yet gender and sexuality have long been fiercely contested and hotly debated, creating oppression, particularly of LGBTQIA+ people, but also more broadly of those who contested sexual and gender moralities, particularly in the end of the 20th century and 21st century, although queer contestations continue to today. Yet polarizations around sexualities and genders is more than looking at them and the divisions around anti-LGBTQIA+. And I think it's important to remember that polarization is also a key feature of feminist communities, of queer communities, and is central to our histories. So polarizations and tensions and divisions within us are also characteristic of the late 20th century and 21st century. Sexualities and gender scholars have critiqued changes, for example, to same-sex marriage, to employment legislations and others, as normalizing, as creating new others. The contestation about whether same-sex marriage is something that should be sought, should be something that is politicized, was ferocious. Similarly, discussions of trans rights and trans inclusions are not new. These debates have been happening since the 1970s. So human rights research in this arena asks how people are excluded and who is excluded and how does marginalization work, how are LGBTQ+ people seeking abortions, gender minorities, and others oppressed, and how is this created through intersectional processes. I'm going to look at a very different question today. So I want to highlight these questions as core to our understandings of human rights and say we also need to look at other things. So, having outlined this, I'm going to turn to what is the Beyond Opposition project. And specifically, I'm going to look at what we found under 3 titles. The first is the goodies and baddies, or the problems with them and us. The second is experiences, and the third is reactions. In order to do this, I'm going to briefly outline the Beyond Opposition project and its roots in heteroactivism before looking to those who are opposed to or concerned about socio-legal changes to gender, sexualities, and abortions. The them to our us. As I say, it would be based in Ireland, Canada, and the UK, but I'm very keen to think about how this works transnationally and also differs, to think about how place matters to the reconstitution of these experiences. So, never mind. So Beyond Opposition asks different questions of social polarization and takes us to explorations that are not located in transnational political realms, which is, of course, the focus of the anti-gender literature, or those who are marginalized because of their genders, sexualities, or reproductive access. All of that is really, really important. And Beyond Opposition argues that we need to augment it with a consideration of other people. So in order to do that, we started with, our Beyond Opposition arose from Catherine Nash and my work on heteroactivism. And this is the book we published. Heteroactivism is a concept that we developed to discuss the ways in which LGBT equalities can be opposed and brought into questions in places where these equalities are seen to be won. And now we focused on places where they're being won. Other people have since taken on heteroactivism and explored other places. The key tenet of heteroactivism is that it seeks to reiterate or recuperate heterosexuality as the most favorable, or heteronormativity, so that's also about gender normativity, as the most favorable aspect of society, as best for society, best for children. Rather than what we found in Canada, Great Britain, and Ireland, was that rather than vilifying gay men and lesbians, heteroactivists opposed things like same-sex marriage or LGBT inclusions in school curricula through reworking new socio-legal orders. So they did things like say, we don't oppose same-sex marriage, but we don't oppose civil partnerships. You can have civil partnerships, but marriage is only for a man and a woman. They would say, it's not that we don't like, gay men, or there's anything wrong with gay men. We just don't think these things should be taught in schools. Or they wouldn't even say that. They would say it's a parent's right to choose what's taught in schools. And in this way, they were going around, working around what are both the legal rights, so what they can say legally in places like Canada and the UK, where there's hate crime legislation, and also they are trying to address this social, where they've become other to the social norm. So it's not the usual. It's not the, and you know, in places like Ireland, where there was a referendum on same-sex marriage, 66% of people voted for same-sex marriage, 33% voted against. The No campaign wasn't run on what might have been expected in the 1990s around, you know, the dangers of gay men or paedophilia or anything like that. It was run on things like a child needs a mother and a father. You have civil partnerships. That's what heteroactivism was trying to capture, that kind of, that difference, and also the activist part of it. They were existing outside of the state in lots of ways and looking to resist particular things. It also challenges these really common assumptions, and these are important because we need to contest the geographies that are part of what we assume about the world map today. So it challenged the idea that some countries are ahead or behind, and this is often associated with colonization and geopolitical or globalization powers, that everyone will eventually get there if they follow the right people, i.e. the UK and USA. Again, US, not great there. I wouldn't include them in my list of winners. That there are winners and losers, countries where we have won and countries where we are losing and need to do something. And that creates a very political, a very geopolitical imaginary of these places that are good and these places that are bad. And in other work with Niharika, we looked at the problems of that as well. Not that legislation is wrong or problematic, but equally it doesn't necessarily make lives livable. And not having it doesn't mean lives aren't livable. We do need legislation and we need other things. But the focus here was that the opposition and the recuperation of heteronormativity will stop eventually. And this is crucial for Beyond Opposition, because the idea that we came into heteroactivism with, and the heteroactivism started with Catherine and I sitting around in her very beautiful, expansive country house, and going, Catherine going, there's these weird people in the, you know, in this part of Canada. They're doing this thing, you know, I'm not sure, like it just seems weird. Should we have a look? So we had a look, and then 10 years later, you know, everything has grown exponentially. So the presumption that people are dying out, that eventually everybody's going to agree with us, that education will change hearts and minds, that those who are older will literally die, and the only people who believe this are older, are hugely problematic. And I'll show this in this presentation. So if that's true, now what do we do? So if we can't change everybody's minds, what is the answer? And that's the question of Beyond Opposition. And we'll come back to that question at the end, but what I want to point to is the lack of research in this area. So, as I've hoped to have shown, there's very little done on oppositions to gender, sexualities and abortions, although there is an exponential rise since 2018. But there is still no research on the everyday spaces of those who are opposed to or have concerns about socio-legal changes to sexualities, genders and abortions. So, and this is really important. So we know about the politics. We know about the discourses. We know how people argue these things in one way or another. But we don't actually know how people live them. We don't know what it's like to be at work or to be at school or to be at university, to live in these ways, in these spaces. And we could argue that these are the wrong people. You could absolutely say that the people we spoke to, and this is a very valid position, and people do argue it all the time with us, that we shouldn't be speaking to them. And we didn't, and I'll come back to this at the end and you can ask me questions about it, we didn't speak to people in a way that was about catching them out. We didn't try to find the fatal flaw and tell them they were wrong. We spoke to them respectfully, we listened, we asked them questions about their lives and we listened. And we didn't try to contradict. And if I was to say this about doing LGBTQIA plus research, or research, you know, that's within feminist or queer veins, you would say, of course, you would never question anyone. So we did feminist and queer research with what might be termed the wrong people. So, yeah, and we sought openness, yeah, and we gave voices to people that people would disagree with us talking to. And again, I'm happy to discuss that at the end. So overall, the project seeks to move beyond opposition. And this is, for those of you who go into academia, you'll know you write huge aims, and then you have to deliver on them. So this was the aim of the project, to move beyond opposition. That's not possible. In the face of increasing social polarization in the UK, Canada, and Ireland. It considers how recent social and legal changes to sexual and gender rights impact different people within these countries. So initially, we focused on the experiences of individuals or groups who do not support the changes. And we explored their everyday lives. So as a geographer, what we looked at was exactly that. What is it like for you at home? What is it like for you with your friends? What is it like for you in public space? What is it like for you at work and holding these positions? We did 161 semi-structured interviews in these places. And what's really important is the sample was really, really diverse. And that's one of the key findings, is that people weren't all the same. But we had a really diverse age range, sexuality, so there were actually LGBT people in the sample. We had people with trans histories, and they had various areas of concern. So some were pro-life, some were anti-same-sex marriage, some were some were gender critical, all kinds of things. And I just want to remind you as I move into the findings that some of what they will say might be upsetting for people. So please just take care of yourself. So the first finding, and each slide has a kind of the summary, the one-sentence summary, and so each title slide has the title, and then this one-sentence summary. So they told us that lumping them all together, including as the far right, was inaccurate and misses the point. So So there's a diversity between those who in our study indicate that they are opposed to or concerned about sexual and gender rights and equalities. We came to this term, and again, we don't love it, but it allows for both the opposition and those who said things like, I'm just worried about bathrooms in the school. I'm just worried about. Rather than necessarily being opposed. They didn't necessarily know yet whether they were opposed. They hadn't maybe fixed their position, or it didn't matter enough to them. But they had concerns. So we called those people with concerns, whereas others were very clear about their position. They were opposed to these things, and here was why. We didn't ask to speak to them. We asked them what their positions were, but we weren't trying to get into their positions. We were trying to explore their everyday lives. So we didn't say, tell us where you stand, let's debate this through. It was, tell us where you stand so we know what positions you're holding, and then let's talk about your everyday life and how it's affected by those positions. So I began this research thinking there were two sides, and that while we, LGBTQIA+, were left-wing, we were trans-inclusive, we were pro-choice, I knew we were heterogeneous. We'd spent decades in queer theory telling us how different we were from each other. I knew there were infighting. I knew that, and I knew that there were extensive critiques of ourselves and each other. Like, I've sat in those conferences and heard them. I've sat in those community meetings. I thought, however, the other side was homogenous, less fractious, coherent. They all had shared values, and I was wrong. In this section, I will show that while some were opposed to abortion, same-sex marriage, trans recognition, and also had views that contested immigration and could be read as far right, indeed some might have even defined themselves as that, the majority of our sample refuted these easy alignments and categorizations. And this is really important for academics. It means that overarching terms or broad social or political categories like left and right, pro and anti, are at best inaccurate. One participant told us, well, when I looked at it, the Beyond Opposition research, immediately I thought there's a whole bunch of issues, gay marriage, abortion, trans activism, that are all sort of lumped in together as one ideological channel. As soon as you speak out against the tactics and goals of trans activism, you're immediately labeled right-wing, and I've been far left all my life. It's an inaccurate and unjust accusation. So interview 28 in Canada was speaking to the Beyond Opposition research that asked for all of these categories to speak to us. And again, I can talk to why it's okay for us to put them all together, even though they don't want to be put all together. They and others spoke of their gender critical and pro-life activism as coming from far left positions, politics and histories. They questioned the ways they were the categories, and this was inaccurate. And as this interviewee said, it was inaccurate and unjust. What I think is important here is the use of the term accusation. I think that says something about how those are felt and heard. It's something that she feels accused of, something that comes from outside, something that lumps them together. And they saw themselves then in opposition to being lumped together. And for some, this created an alliance between those who would otherwise not see themselves as similar. So in the lumping together, there is a productive moment. Participants told us they disliked and indeed rightfully and forcefully rejected being lumped in with each other. They spoke of differences, disagreements, and the plain, and as with interview 28, the inaccuracy of mine, and I would argue many other assertions that just simply says this is far right and dismisses them. Two interviewees told us, so interview 8 in Canada told us, I find really troubling about why this is so toxic and has started to spill out into my day-to-day life is that we're all just lumped under one umbrella of hate. It really, really saddens and angers me in equal measure. And then an interviewee in Britain said, certain communities have kind of lumped people they view as their opponents in this bucket of undesirables. So, of course, being lumped together is not neutral. As these interviewees show, they are labelled as hateful or undesirable. And whilst they understood their positions, and for some of those who were active, their activism as motivated by love, more often they saw it as motivated by human rights, things like women's rights or the rights of the unborn child, in ways that replicate political discourses in this area and that effectively as in emotionally, affectively drove their actions. And that's clear in other places. It's clear that these politics around anti-gender and pro-life, others have talked about how these political things are pushed and are based not just in rational thinking, but also in emotional, affective reactions and interactions. For us, and it's clear in our sample, that there are people I would agree with on almost everything, and those who I would fundamentally disagree with on almost everything. The sides varied depending on the area of sexualities, genders, right-left politics, environmentalism, migration, and a myriad of other things. Refusing easy categorization is an imperative on academics who can too easily conflate political movements and deployments with personal positionings and experiences. So I'm not saying there are not political movements out there. I'm not saying they're not using people, and they're not saying they have a support base. I'm saying there's a difference between political movements and their everyday lives, and we need to look at their everyday lives. So in addition, there are undoubtedly shared alliances, but these are not necessary or inevitable. And the political allegiances and alliance contest an imagining of a unified common enemy under any banner, including that of the far right. And again, I want to point to the necessity sometimes of a common enemy. Sometimes a common enemy helps us to protest. Sometimes a common enemy allows change to happen. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it also can create a particular dichotomy, can create a binary that is inaccurate. And we need to be careful, again, as academics, of those binaries. I'm not saying groupings and individuals are not deployed in ways that are categorized as far right, and indeed our participants talked about not wanting to be used in this way and not wanting their opinions on politics to be used in this way, and some were driving these agendas. But there isn't coherence, and for me that's really helpful. So I'm very Butlerian. I like the idea of things being performed, that there are cracks and fissures that we can find, and in those cracks and fissures we find change. This is also true. So this common enemy can also feel insurmountable. This is not a common enemy. they're not the same, they're not homogenous. So when people often say, well, you know, the left, it's so divided, and if we could only come together, because look, the right is so coherent, and I say, no, come here. Look at this data, the right's not coherent. It's not, but it also plays on its incoherence, and that's something maybe the left doesn't do. Anyway, much bigger discussion. It is, however, to insist that explorations of actual people allow for these fractures and fissures that are often attributed to queer communities, pro-choice, and other communities and social movements. These fissures and multiple positionings that did not fit are clear in our data. So this is an interview participant from Ireland who says, the view that I would be most disagreement with would be repeal the ACE. So for those of you who don't know, in 2018, Ireland had a vote on abortion access. Before that, the rights of the unborn child were written in to the Constitution as equal to the rights of the mother, and it meant that very little access to healthcare was available. In 2018, a vote was taken to remove that clause from the Constitution, and again, it won by just over 66%, which shows a kind of significant shift. When it was inserted in 1983, it was inserted on a 66-67% majority. She says, however, I can't even remember what I voted in the other referendum, by which she means the same-sex marriage referendum, which was in 2015. And during the interview, she kind of forgets even when the same-sex marriage referendum was. But she later clarifies that not only would she vote for it, she would campaign for it within the Catholic Church, because she sees herself as this liberal Catholic. So, you know, this kind of not the same. But what she constantly feels, or what she says she's constantly feeling, is being packaged or put into a box. So she sees herself within these kind of liberal Catholics, but she's not pro-choice, which a lot of liberal Catholics would be. And then there might be the conservative on other parts of the Catholic faith, but she's more progressive than that. And then when she looks at the environmental movement, which is generally very pro-choice, she feels like she's a lone voice there, trying to mobilize faith communities around the environmental issue. And she doesn't identify with people like there's pro-life Facebook groups. But what she says, which I think is really interesting, and she talks about the media, but I think it's in other spheres as well. She says, like the media wants, especially news wants, stories that reinforce narratives that are simple for people to understand. So we've got the goodies and the baddies. We've got the yes and the no. And she's talking there specifically about the Irish referendums on same-sex marriage and abortion. So you're either good, you vote yes, you're bad, you vote no. And that's very much the contestation of what we saw in the data. So just as there are schisms between us, there's a myriad of ways that people are opposed to or concerned about sexual, gender, sex, and gender issues and abortion. Some people who support certain issues do not support or are not concerned about other issues. And this can mean that they do not see themselves as similar to people who are pro-life, people who are anti-same-sex marriage, or believe that a woman's place is in the home. And some participants did believe that. Similarly, positionings in terms of equalities occupied various positions in terms of same-sex marriage and trans recognition. Again, not everybody. Some of the pro-life people were very trans-inclusive. You just can't define along these lines. Similarly, so those who were pro-life or consistent life often focused their positioning. So in Canada, they talk about this consistent life, which they argue everybody has human rights, and so there is no place for euthanasia or abortion. That's the broad kind of understanding of consistent life, and they come at that very much from a human rights perspective, where everybody has the right to life. Again, you might argue with the positions, I'm just outlining them. When considering people's personal circumstances, their positions did not equate to identities or relationships. Our sample included people who identified as gay and lesbian, parents of gender non-conforming children, those who had trans histories, and they also varied by age. Those who were younger questioned and contested the assumptions that those who occupied these positionings are disappearing or dying out, which was, of course, read as offensive. In the data, there were moments of intense vulnerability. of values, actions that were, to me, were valuable and worthwhile, and yet the positions they hold and the activism some people pursued can cause marginalization and harm to others. For me, a queer lens allows me to hold in tension the power relations that seek to recuperate certain heteronorms at a time where they are somewhat contested. So I do believe that we have created a different world in the 21st century. I do think we have rights that we didn't have in the late 20th century. I don't think as academics we've fully grasped what that means and the ways in which the world is reconstructed around these new rights and these new lives that we can have as LGBTQIA+ people. And what I'm looking for is avoiding simplistic binaries of goodies, baddies, pro, anti, in ways that do not reject or neglect power relations, but also at the same time do not assume their form or formation. Again, very much a queer theorist. So I ask you to consider how academic thinking that asks us to deconstruct binaries often also reiterates them as the other, without neglecting the harms of exclusion and marginalization that we know exist from the extensive literatures on LGBTQIA+ and those affected by abortion experiences. So that's the first chapter in a nutshell. The second chapter looks at experiences. So they told us that they had negative experiences because of their positions, is the summary. So participants occupied various positions to what were seen as mainstream, and that's why we were interested in Canada, the UK, and Ireland. We were interested in those who were seen as somewhat outside the mainstream, what they sometimes termed the new normal, and there was a recognition for some of them. They understood themselves as in the minority and offensive. So some people called themselves offensive. Some participants feared being publicly attacked because what they now see as their minority positions, whereas once they felt that they were in the majority. So this Canadian participant said, I feel that these days minority opinions are, sometimes being attacked. And if you don't fall into what everybody believes is right and everybody in the news is wrong and you challenge the status quo, you get all sorts of repercussions. I would share my frank views on them, but I feel that minority opinions these days are being trampled on, and you have to walk on eggshells. You have to be so careful not to offend anyone with your language. And I personally think that it's not fair to the minority groups, which maybe 10 or 20 years ago they were the majority, but now they have to be politically correct, and they have now become the minority group. And I think that's really important, that shift, and recognizing that shift that people are seeing and experiencing from a position of being a majority to now walking on eggshells. This participant obviously sees this as unfair, and given the possible repercussions, and they were not alone in this, given the possible repercussions, we're very cautious about sharing their positions anywhere. But particularly people were really, really cautious at work. They worried about losing their jobs. They worried about being sanctioned. They worried about not getting promotion. They worried that basically, if people knew where they stood on some of these things, they wouldn't be able to work, and then they wouldn't be able to support their family and so on. So they very much kept quiet. So others, however, didn't see they were in a majority. They thought they were didn't see themselves as being in a minority. They thought they were in the majority, but the government and the media, who were catering for some people, pandering usually to an LGBTQIA+ minority, they saw themselves as the majority, but the silent majority. So again, we can recognize some of those political discourses coming through in their words. There was little doubt that for most, but not all participants, their positions affected their lives because of the new legislations and social norms in Canada, Ireland, and Great Britain. And I'm just going to show you 3 examples that kind of starkly highlight some of the ways their positions affected their lives. So this participant in Canada says, I'll tell you about the coffee shop because it really opened my eyes to the path into the rabbit hole, if you will. About 3 years ago, I saw a sign on a local coffee shop door saying, no swerfs, no turfs, no swerfs, no all right. All right. So for those who don't know, TERF is trans exclusionary radical feminists. Swerfs are sex workers exclusionary radical feminists. And it had little hearts all over it. And it reminded me so vividly of signs from the 40s and 50s, no blacks, no Jews allowed. And I thought, what on earth is a TERF? What on earth is a swerf? This is strange. So I started Googling, and when I started like trying to find the different approaches, I was like, who are these horrible people? What exactly are they saying? And then I landed on people who are very articulate, bright women who are compassionate. I discovered an online feminist magazine, and through that I learned that women's groups exist in Canada. So I started being able to identify other women who are concerned about these issues. And the interviewer asked her, what's the benefit? And she said, I don't feel so alone. When I was in the local cafe, essentially say, if you don't like our version of feminism, go home, I actually started taking counselling because I felt so isolated and fearful for a while. Naming who was not welcome in a coffee shop resulted in this interviewee exploring unfamiliar terms. Evoking historical acts for her meant that she aligned the contemporary moment with those who were wrong for putting up signs that excluded marginalised others in the past in ways that would not be acceptable or indeed legal in Canada and elsewhere today. While studies might explore the false equivalence of this, it's not the point of this research. Instead, I want to note that this association prompted the participants to know more. Exploring what the terms meant, who was unwelcome in the coffee shop, what an interviewee terms horrible people, they became for her, when she explored it, very articulate, bright women who are compassionate. So this creation of goodies and baddies reappears. So the polarization of good and evil is apparent in her narrative, where participants believed others saw those who held their positions as evil and wrong. The naming of those unwelcome in the cafe because of their position in relation to trans issues and sex work and far or alt-right homogenizes those who were named as horrible people. Rejecting their sameness, she finds herself aligning with some of those who are named in the sign. They are not distant others. She then feels alone and fearful because of this. So this is Harry. Harry's one of my key participants who I quote all the time because I think this speaks a lot to kind of queer abolitionists and to what are we doing and do we mean to be doing what we're doing. So Harry says, I got a phone call from my office and they were saying that the police had arrived there and wanted to speak to me because of stuff I'd put on Twitter. This is, so these interviews were done kind of over the pandemic, so 2019 to kind of 2021. So it wasn't X yet, basically. So he said to me that they were investigating a hate crime and that there had been a complaint. Within 3 or 4 days of me first hitting the press, so they said they were investigating a complaint, they then released the details to the press, is his story. I live in a tiny little village and they posted a screenshot of the only bed and breakfast place, which is 100 meters from my door. And they suggested they gathered there to play golf. What they were meaning was, let's bring golf clubs. And the interview asks who, and he says trans rights activists. And somebody posted that my wife and children should be hunted down, raped and skinned alive. And I sent that threat on to the local police, and that wasn't considered to be remotely dangerous. Me saying these transgender remembrance isn't a thing prompted a visit from police and authorization of an inspector, assistant chief constable, going to the press, and 100,000 worth of costs on their side trying to shut me down. I always figured that I could protect my family. If you're going to unleash the full force of the police based on a tweeted question and a few comments online, then it seems kind of odd operating without fear and favour when you don't treat the threats of rapes and being skinned alive with a similar degree of seriousness. So legal changes have meant that state support, that there is state support for interventions around LGBTQIA+ attacks, and this encompasses social media in the UK, and it includes legal sanctions for those breaking the laws. And of course, I want to acknowledge that this can disproportionately target racialized young and working class people, as queer abolitionists have long argued, as well as trans people. But for Harry, who lived in a village, was not racialized, and has grown up children, the consequences of his social media activity transgressed his spatial scales. He thought of his social media activity as distant, national if not international, and not directly relating to an individual. And he's talked about how the danger he experienced versus what he felt he had created. So in this narrative, he very much locates his fear, but also the danger that he felt for his wife and family. And I think we need to be really clear about these hate legislation and hate crime legislations and the effects of them for those who are subject to them. And that matters because I'll come back to that in the next section. So experiences of threats and being associated with the positions under discussion had various reactions. Some participants were extremely fearful and cautious, monitoring their exposure and finding support in safe communities with like-minded friends and families. So moving on to the third section, which is reactions. What they told us was that they reacted to these experiences differently. This included being really afraid and not doing things, like not coming out at work, being careful what they say, and we have 147 pages of quotes about how careful they are about what they say, and also starting or solidifying their activism. I'm going to focus a bit more on the latter in this section. So they did also find safer community spaces. They created work-related connections around their positions. But they did speak of being really scared. So interview 22 in Britain said that he was scared shitless, that his interview for this research could be found and used against him. So people were very nervous about being involved in this research, about speaking openly. We have extensive protections in place to make sure that their data isn't breached, but they were very, very nervous. Participants' key fears pertain to being named or associated with their positions and their lives being ruined if they expressed an opinion other people disagreed with, which one participant said. One participant expressed fear of being firebombed and making the risks too high, and that was a gender-critical person with a gender non-conforming child. Another expressed a fear of people coming up and what they said, sorting me and beating me up. Others knew someone who had experienced negative reactions and said they lacked the bravery to step forward. So this was a gender-critical woman who said, I know women who've been beaten up. I know women who've had their windows broken. Fabulous feminists in the past have been much braver. And but as I get older, I get less and less courageous. I've climbed walls and things and got into nuclear facilities. So what she's referencing there is Greenham Common, which in the 1980s feminists surrounded to stop nuclear bombs coming into Britain. And they used to do all these actions, and it was a lesbian separatist space, and it was only women only, and it was a huge kind of political moment in Britain for feminism. So she's referencing that she was there. And done stuff like that when I was younger and tough, but I'm old and weak now. So, although experiences and threats and being associated, although some participants did experience public space as difficult, particularly when their positions were known, they weren't dissuaded from holding their positions. So they held them quietly, even when they were careful about where they expressed them. Indeed, their views were often emboldened by confrontation, by opposition, and they found new tactics and new ways to share their positions. They often talked about doing things verbally rather than in writing. They set up various Discord groups, and they used anonymous accounts. And when I hear and listen to what interviewees did, even when we tried to go to certain conferences during the pandemic, it's very much what lesbian feminists used to do to find space away from heterosexual society, to find that kind of the safety that wasn't there. So people said, I just want to get through life. Or this interview said, I don't want any hassle. I want to express my views, and I could do it under my real name, but then you're just inviting, I'm not really the martyr type. It's just a lot easier. So again, it's not that people aren't expressing their views either. I can understand people saying it's genuinely cowardly and I should do it under my own name, and I respect that as a point of view, but I just feel it's a lot easier to do it under a name. It means there's no comeback. So distancing themselves from their views allows participants to compartmentalize their engagements, such that their positions are not visible in other aspects of their lives. Participants also navigated public spaces and their possible exposure by creating closed online and in-person groups. These spaces were created in ways that ensured exclusions, often by, and in gender-critical spaces, these were sex-based definitions of a woman. So those who joined were vetted in some cases, including a phone call, so they would have to ring someone, their voice would have to sound feminine enough to be allowed in the group. And this seeks to prevent what they perceive as attacks and to create space that are safe for them to express their shared opinions that are seen as dangerous in other spaces. As I say, these tactics are reminiscent of those used to create women's spaces in the late 20th century. And indeed, some organisers of events we attended were involved in creating these spaces historically. Where spaces move into the material spaces, they can be protected and create connections and communities. So this is Venice, and Venice very much spoke of not being able to organise an event between trans people and allies and gender-critical feminists. There was venue cancellations, and then when the event did take place, there was physical altercations and police involvement. So somebody was arrested and they were later charged. She told us what her reaction was. So she said, the event very much changed my position on the subject, because at the time I was very much like, oh, if we could just get together in there, and she names the organisation, and talk about this, I'm sure we can find some kind of solution, you know, off social media. But it didn't turn out like that. And then there was so many tweets with death threats and bomb threats, and it was just horrible what was written about us. It made me less in the middle, if you know what I mean. It made me more towards one side. I just sort of felt that there was a misunderstanding. But when it became personal and scary, I just came to the conclusion that I think, and she pauses for a long time, I think that transgenderism is wrong. So what did she do? She decided to do more events in different places in the country, whereas originally the intention was just to do one in my local community. I did 10 different events, and she says it didn't really get big until it was cancelled. If they just let it go ahead with no publicity, it would have gone ahead and ended. It would have been another local meeting, wouldn't it? It was the fact that there was violence there. It made it go international. And that's all my emphasis. Where division around this case is trans exclusion and inclusions, one solution is often proposed is debate or discussing, presumably to find a common ground, middle ground, or resolution. And I'll talk about why I don't think that that's the answer in a bit. Yet debating trans people's lives and existence has been extensively critiqued, leaving activists and others to argue for no debate. So taking the former view that debate and dialogue are needed, the event Venice organised had personal and political repercussions in ways that she did not anticipate. Where debate and discussion were not possible, the event was met with protests and threats. It became personal and scary. The proximity and immediacy of the issue increased for her. It became more personal, more political. She attributes the solidifying of her position to these experiences. Seeking to cancel gender-critical events and protesting outside them can demonstrate support for trans people and offer feelings of empowerment. How they are perceived by those who organise them and the results of these protests can be at best overlooked. What Venice's narrative shows that this could be an error. The conflict and oppositions not only drove Venice to do more events, she attributes the increased publicity of these events and the issues themselves to the protests. For others, their political activism and increased success was attributed to the opposition they encountered. So for Harry, this was with the police, and you'll remember Harry from the last section. So the response to Harry's tweets were for him personal, jarring, and intimate. He says, after the incident with the police, I did a summary on Twitter, a thread, and it went absolutely viral. I had journalists knocking down my door from across the world about it. So suddenly my profile went sky high, and at that point, a bunch of former police officers, barristers, and other interested parties got in touch with me, and we decided to organise. So initially it was about my case, but it was also designed to support the likes of Graham Lenihan, Posey Parker. Those are kind of quite famous gender-critical people in the UK. And, you know, a few other notable feminists who had been in trouble with the police. Once I've sort of become infamous, they reached out to me. We threatened them, and he means local councils in England and Wales, and the Crown Prosecution Service, who were all trying to introduce trans toolkits into their services with a judicial review, and they withdrew it. They withdrew the trans supportive guidance. I mean, they knew they were wrong. They knew it. I suspect that they cut and pasted from a Stonewall document and they published it thinking it would be waved through. But there are a number of us looking at these documents right now. We are now in a position, particularly on the back of my win, to go, we know how to do judicial reviews. We're getting a lot of wins now outside of the courts. It's costing us all a fortune, but we're doing it by crowd justice. And he also means crowdfunding. It's one of those things that the second you hit the news in any way, shape or form, the crowdfund goes up because you get into the papers. So we're doing it that way, and it's risky. And so the interview said, and were you political at all before? And he said, was I? Hell no, not in the slightest. I'm probably conservative with a small c. I've never been in modern politics at all. It's only when it landed at my door. So for Harry, the experience landed at his door. It's threatening in its physical proximity. And Harry used his experience to drive his work in this arena and support others. This moved him from somebody who's never been in modern politics to engaging directly with local governments, national public sector organisations, and supporting key protagonists. More than this, his experience in court and the development of understandings means that he can successfully challenge the implementation of trans toolkits and what he terms such documents. Whilst expensive, news coverage based in division and opposition fuels crowdsourced funding that he and the organisation that he works with relies on. This shows the multidimensional, personal, community, media and organisational, productive aspects of opposition that are created through experiences that land at my door. The retelling of Harry's experiences led to an exponential rise in reach, increase in his reach and influence, shaping his emerging activism and actions. More than creating a supportive community, Harry has used his experience to drive work in this arena, supporting others. This moved him from being someone who has never been in modern politics to engaging directly. The financing that Harry discusses also upends some of the ways that these forms of politics can be critiqued. As it's being, so very often people say, follow the money's coming from America, the money's coming from here, the money's coming from there. If you follow the money, you'll find the real political actors behind it. What Harry shows is that there are local political actors. There is not a kind of hidden, other people funding him. He's funding, crowdsourcing funding. So it's a very different experience. It shows, so it offers a different perspective on following the money. Instead, it shows that these actions and activisms can emerge from the experiences and engagements with state institutions, and from these gain coverage and publicity that was initially unwelcome and is now courted. So initially, Harry didn't want the attention. He was really upset. Now he wants it. Now he courts it. Now he asks for it. Now he looks for it. Here, following the money would point from the action to the money rather than the other way around. He is clear that his activism is affecting change. It's stopping cut and paste, some might argue that's good practice, trans inclusions, and limiting the influence of trans-inclusive organisations such as Stonewall in Great Britain. So what I hope to have shown in this section is how contestations of socio-legal changes to gender, sexualities and abortions are developed, produced, gain traction, recognition and funding through opposition. Now this wasn't the case for all participants, and as I've shown, many were fearful about their positions becoming known. They feared losing jobs and livelihood, friends, and being subject to public attack and ridicule. And this fear drove them to be very wary, revealing their positions on sexualities and genders. A lot quietly supported, but weren't publicly involved. So they did the day-to-day work of some of these organisations. For others, they were already publicly named, so there was no loss to them in going and having this activism because they were already, like Harry, in the media. So there wasn't a way of hiding again. Either through their own choice, so some of them chose to be activists, some of them were very clear that that was what they wanted to be public, or they organised events or policed reports or online naming. Participants who came in this section, who came to or were spurred on in their activism through various confrontations detailed in the previous section. So it was very clear to them that their experiences had led to their activisms. There was very few people who said, I'm active because I believe this is for the betterment of civilization. And, you know, it's got nothing to do with me, but I'm an activist because of that. There were some, but they weren't generally there. There were more people who were scared, and then people whose activism came from their personal experiences. Those who now engage in work and activism sought to produce different worlds. They wanted worlds that would solidify and place sex bodies and boundaries, reintroduce restrictions on abortions, limit same-sex marriage and/or sex education in schools, amongst other things. They contended that this was because the issue landed at their door, or their positions were solidified through their actions of those who opposed them. Their experiences drove their actions in part because they were felt to be unjust, highlighting a need for them to take action, for them, as they felt, to do something. So I'm going to have quite a long conclusion. I think I've got enough time, yeah? I don't know. Oh, okay, sorry, a bit quick. So the interviewee from Canada who didn't agree to quote them directly, so they were so worried about the project that we can't actually use their words, said that she didn't have the chance to learn about the mold outside of heterosexuality. She said that people are going to think she's bigoted if she walks into a room with those who fundamentally disagree with her. We asked people about being in rooms with people who disagreed with them. But the question she asks is if it would ever be possible to be more knowledgeable about different lifestyles, to come together without judgment. She asks if it ever was, if it already happens and if it already exists. So it's clear from this data that social polarizations are defining lives, loves, and political actions. I have shown how some can react to their experiences of confrontations with institutions, protests, and people who challenge them online or in person, name them as bigots, call the police, engage in physical and verbal fights, and/or cancel their events that attempt discussion. The encounters created, solidified, and spurred on emerging or existing positions on gender, sexuality, and abortion. Perhaps more importantly, it reproduced their activisms and their work to create change. The interviewees who spoke of their mobilization around sexualities, genders, and abortions, that in their terms were having success and in political and social spheres. They directly related their activism to encounters that they said landed at my door. The activisms they encountered, however, can be seen as successful. For example, the events were closed down. The debates were stopped. Those who might incite hate were punished, and problematic views were challenged. And I'm not saying there's not important work to be done. There is very, very important work to be undertaken through protests, debates, lobbying, living out in proud lives, and other ways that people require to survive and thrive. Actions such as no platforming, lodging complaints with the police, arguing on social media, identifying those who are bigots and not to be engaged with, can be meaningful, empowering, and be felt as supportive for communities working with us against them. But what this research shows is that it can also create oppositional activism, embolden people, encourage them to find out who these terrible people are. Oppositional activism cannot address social polarization and divisions because it relies on them to identify the enemy, to be found and fought. In this way, the oppositions discussed in this paper both derive from social polarizations and drive them. The actions and activisms that emerge from contestations of anti-gender, gender-critical, anti-LGBTQIA+, pro-life politics will also be limited, if desperately important, focused as they are on marginalized and vulnerable people. They're central and they're limited at the same time. The question of what can be done to address social polarization is thus a valid question, alongside other questions that seek to understand, support, and support marginalized and vulnerable people. From my previous work with others, this question relied on an acknowledgement that not all will be accepting of socio-legal changes around sexualities and genders and abortions. And again, I'm not saying that working within systems such as education isn't valuable. It's perhaps to concede that it's not totalistic. It's not a panacea. And people will continue to hold personal, religious, and societal positions that will not agree with the social and legislative landscapes that exist around gender, sexuality, and abortion in places like Ireland, Canada, and Great Britain. In Beyond Opposition, we sought to listen. And I hope this paper has shown that listening to those who have concerns about our rights, inclusions and acceptances is not easy, but it is important. We were respectful and treated participants as we would treat other participants in queer and feminist research. Even where we did not agree, we listened. In this way, we learned about activisms and their formations in this paper, and we know more about opposition and what it does. Listening allowed us insights to rehumanize the other and consider the effects of experiences of, as some have argued, being in the minority when it comes to gender, sexuality, and abortion. Listening respectfully and following an ethos that does not denigrate, catch out, or vilify gives us new understandings, but we know it's not enough. And these are, of course, just a small proportion of the 161 interviews that participants had because they publicly expressed their views or their work. There's also discussions of work, friendships, jobs, and places. What I want to understand, or what I want to say, is that some might see these experiences as justified. They hold positions that for some are not okay. So you might argue that this is an appropriate response. You might say it's necessary. You might even say it's a good response. And that is a good position to hold as well. You might think they are justified in their experiences, or their experiences are justified because of the positions they hold. I still think it's important to recognize and understand and consider if these experiences are justified, if this is the world we want to live in, and what is created through these social polarizations. I think more is needed to engage in ways that do not retrench polarized positions, closed communities. And I'm happy to talk about this in discussion. We've run 3 workshops and discussion groups to consider how we might live together where we fundamentally disagree. We kind of have to get to that point of the research. And in these spaces, we don't seek to change minds or debate. So in the spaces we created, we actually said, you're not allowed to debate the issues. We want you to think about how you live together, knowing that you can't change somebody's mind. So it wasn't a debate, it wasn't a discussion, it was how do we do this? What are the ways that we get to various bits? The dangers of getting people into the room, you can imagine the ethics forums for those of you who've done ethics. The dangers of getting people into the room were huge, and I'm happy to answer questions on how we did this. And of course, I'm not suggesting that this should surplace or supplant or that we shouldn't look at marginalized people or discriminations. Of course we should. I'm saying that we should do this as well. So I'm going to finish up soon. But what Beyond Opposition therefore asks for is a very different focus, a focus on polarization itself, its effects, its entrenchment and reproduction. And rather than focusing on division through marginalization, which of course is important, what does it mean to look at the opposition itself and the ways that it's currently constructing sides, lives, and politics? And the key questions, how might we live together when we disagree? And how can we live together if we don't agree on same-sex marriage, gender recognition, trans life, abortion, and sex education? Are the questions that Beyond Op asked. The presumption that people will be educated away or disappear, I think, is long gone. I hope it is. So now we have to ask these different questions. Before I go to the floor, though, there are some things that just don't work or is not where this project is going. And I think as academics, we need to be critical of these things as well. It's important to note what cannot be excluded and to avoid some key pitfalls. So there's some key pitfalls here that make this a really complex thing. There's not an easy answer. There's not a simple solution. As any good academic will say, there's a need for more research. But one of the key things that people say is, this kind of idea of false equivalence. I'm not suggesting that we should equivocate experiences of marginalization with the experiences of these participants. In fact, what I'm arguing is that the concepts that we currently have can't be applied in the same way. And the concepts we have are based in 20th century, late 20th century understandings of heteronormativity, which don't account for 21st century landscapes. So the concepts we have are not good enough. And no, I'm not suggesting that oppressions are the same for everyone. So we're not looking for, we just need to be nice to each other. Equally, I don't think the answer is that there's a middle ground or compromise. We don't ask, and this is the kind of, again, a false equivalence, but one that helps me to think this through is, you know, in Northern Ireland, through the peace process, we didn't ask people who were unionists to become Republicans or vice versa. So it is about having difficult conversations where people hold entrenched positions. What do we do? How do we live together? What are the ways that we might do this? And of course, Northern Ireland offers lots of examples, and it holds on to the power relations of colonialism and all the other things there. So it's not about negating power relations at all, and that's why I think it's way more complex than just going, oh, let's find common ground. And then I also want to be really clear that it doesn't equate to stopping progressive ideals or searches for more liberatory worlds. It does question the power relations of whose worlds can become reality and what that means for those who would find these worlds unlivable. So it questions the idea of whose worlds are we creating and how. And what I often say when I'm talking about this project is to think about how we're using tactics that were used against LGBTQIA+ people in the 20th century. The police, the legislation, institutions. What does it mean to reuse these tactics? How are we buying into these tactics? How are we creating them if things were to change? What might be used against us in a new era? Those are things that keep me up at night. Okay, so so as I'm going to finish just with this last paragraph, as I move to the discussion, I want us to consider as academics the nuance, the detail, the accuracy that are important, alongside queries, questions, and tensions that offer no easy resolution. It's imperative for us to work within and with problematic power relations that define our worlds and our often complicit place within them. This requires that some of us recognize how our sexualities and genders, while still other and different and less than, are also afforded recognition that was once considered impossible. I would urge complex and multifaceted discussions that refuse easy solutions. And I think we can deploy academic thinking and research in ways that question, inquiry, and engage. There is no one answer, nor do I think there is one universal right tactic, appropriate for everyone, every situation, offering a unified and universal response. But what I do think is really dangerous is only deploying vilification, a politics of condemnation that does not and will not stop these activisms. Indeed, as this paper has shown, these tactics may well create and solidify gender-critical pro-life and heteroactivisms, as well as playing into the broader narratives that further political appeals. And those I'm thinking of, you know, discussions of cancel culture, wokeism, freedom of speech, furthering political appeals. Together, these activisms and political appeals have, and perhaps in Great Britain already have had, will have social and legal consequences. Rehashing arguments, terms, and power relations that define the 20th century is only partially useful in these changing sexual and gendered landscapes of the 21st century. So I just want to finish by saying this is not work for everyone. Only some of us should do it. It's hard, and it's difficult, and it's painful, and it's not something that everyone should engage in, but I think it's really important to do. And I think, thinking about you, I'd be really interested in what this is like in Spain, in Catalonia, but also in all the other places that are familiar to you, to thinking through these issues and these debates. So thank you very much.
Many thanks. Congratulations for your inspiring words. Now we have some minutes in order to write some debate. Who want to start? Yes. Let's do this way if you agree. We can gather some 2, 3 questions and then leave you the floor again.
Absolutely.
Thank you. You.
Yeah, I'm from the UK. So my question was quite specific. It's regarding Harry's case. I just was interested in, you mentioned that he originally was approached by the police because of his tweets, and then you said that he wasn't political, and I wondered whether or not if the things that what those tweets involved, and like if they were targeting the trans group in a hateful way. I'm not saying that the response was justified, but there is, I would argue maybe that he was political in the first place, and that, I don't know.
Just answer that, because that's, yes, he didn't see himself as political. He saw himself as writing tweets. After he wrote the tweets and the police were involved, his tweets were way more, they reached far more people, and then he was able to get involved in organisations and all that kind of thing. So, but yes, the only reason the police would have got involved is if there was something that they defined as hate speech in them. So the whole point of the project isn't to question Harry's interpretation of it, it's to explore how Harry's experiences reiterate his activism, but also for him, he's fascinating in that he was just somebody who was writing tweets about Transgender Day of Remembrance, which I imagine many would find offensive. And then he's speaking to, Graham Linehan and doing judicial reviews. So it's that kind of understanding of what happens when it escalates, what happens when people are picked out and targeted in that way. And also, again, queer abolitionists would contest the state being involved at all. So it's an interesting kind of support of their argument in that, what are we doing by creating this hate legislation? What we think we're doing is making the world safer, but actually, even research with LGBT people says arresting people for beating up LGBT people doesn't necessarily make LGBT people safer. What we need to do is very different things. So, yeah.
One and two,
Okay, so my name's Alex and I'm from Spain. And I basically wanted to ask you do you feel that social media is helping perpetuate this forced binary, the us versus them mentality that you were talking about? And if you think this is the case, what can we do about it legislatively or politically speaking?
Yeah. Hello. I'm Luca. I'm from here. Thank you for your interesting speech. I wanted to ask that you said that regarding these conclusions, maybe we need to approach differently this hate speech or these kind of contestations to the feminism and LGBT rights. But do you have any suggestions on how to deal with this in a different way?
Will I take those two? Yeah.
I'm Oriola, you also from Barcelona. And one question, more on the personal way, is that I remember when the independence question here in Spain, how polarized was society, but then when you found other people close by in your social circles, such as family or friends, that didn't agree with you, you humanized them and their points were more understandable. So in your personal opinion, how important is to humanize the other opinion? How this, for example, seeing Harry's perspective on how he became in the position that he is nowadays, how important is that you humanize those people and to be able to understand their positions also? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take those if that's okay. Can I take those three? Because they'll fit nicely. Is that okay? Yeah. So I think the first and the third, so Alex and Julio's, relate to each other really nicely. So I think, yes, social media drives its content through opposition. It's a key way in which it drives its content. It's a key way in which it drives its money generating. is opposition. And I think, and if we focus on opposition per se as something that isn't necessarily problematic but is potentially problematic, then we can think about this rehumanizing the other and also what we might do about it. Because the question you're asking, you know, hate speech, contestation, those are all really important. I'm not saying don't do those things. What I'm saying is there is an increasing problem around social polarization that's driving particular areas in ways that we are not understanding or recognizing. So in a true academic way, I have no solution, but I have complexity. No, I think the focus on opposition leads us somewhere else. So what does it mean to be opposed? How are we opposed? In what ways are we opposed? And at the same time, maybe even more important is to say, how are people marginalized? How do we make sure that they're not marginalized? What are the policies and things we can put in place? So, you know, what can we do about the binaries of social media? I think I'm not a social media scholar, so I'm not going to pretend that I know enough academically from that area. In my head, I thought, you know, this project might lead to some solutions around how we might humanize the other, because I think that's one of the key issues around social media, is that non-humanizing. And one of the key findings really from the workshops, which we haven't done enough kind of analysis of yet, but one of the key things is people avoid conflict all the time in really interesting ways, and we do it all the time. We have sisters, brothers who hold all kinds of views. We have uncles, aunts, we have friends, people who we like, people who we humanize, people who we might play hockey with, people who we do things with, and we avoid these kinds of discussions. It's one of the key ways that we live our daily lives without constantly fighting. But that's only possible for some people. And we need to recognize the privilege in avoidance as well, and the way that operates. So in answer to your question, yes, I absolutely think dehumanizing the other, it changes how people see themselves. So in the workshops, again, what was fascinating was what people expected the other to look like. So what people expected people who were opposed to same-sex marriage to look like. They expected, you know, an older man, an older white man, and then you know, have this younger woman with bright purple hair. You know, like there is a kind of humanity to people, and they have a chat over coffee about, you know, something that they find in common. And that's where I see, you know, it's not about common ground around the key issues, but there might be ways of finding commonality that's not necessarily common ground, and doesn't necessarily mean we'll be on the same side of the vote. But if we see the opposition itself as potentially problematic, we can explore that in and of itself. Does that make sense? So rather than saying we should have this, or, you know, and without, as I say, negating marginalization. Does that answer all your questions? I'm happy to say more.
Some more questions, please? Yes, Kath. First.
Hi, Kath.
Hi. How are you? Thank you for
I'm
coming.
Melanie from Maria's team.
Yeah. We met last time I was in Barcelona.
Okay, so thank you very much. It was an incredible presentation. I think it's really important to interview these people, so I want to know everything about the ethical considerations. How did you manage that, your positionality, and so on? And if you can like deepen into that and elaborate on that.
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you very much for this. I mean, that was really impressive, to be honest. I also like it very much, the approach, because usually, at least in our department, or maybe not Maria's group, but I mean, we don't do this kind of narrative stories.
Oh, okay.
There is so much interesting information, not just for academic, but also I would say for public policies. Okay, and I think we are missing this point oftentimes, at least in our I would say in our department, but also in general in Spain. I mean, I think in the UK, in Ireland, in these countries, I mean, all of this kind of approach is much more appealing, compelling, and much more used. But anyway, I have a couple of issues here. One is because everything is going around this social polarization, okay? And what I like very much from your research is that you are looking at both sides, okay? On the one hand, marginalization, on the other hand, this kind of opposition, and trying to understand what is going on both sides. And my question here is that, well, of course, this is important, and this can be applied, obviously, for every single conflict we have. You have been focused on basically on sexual and gender issues, which is fine, but you can apply this anywhere. And the issue is how relevant is, for example, what kind of findings, what kind of suggestions you can make for really providing nice public policies on this, because at the end of the day, the main responsible people for matching all these views are through public policies, policymakers. Okay. I also would like to extend a little bit the previous question by Alex, because it's not only a matter of social networks. Okay, it's a matter of social media. I believe that the main responsible for everything which is going on are the media. Okay, general concept of media, not only social media. At the end of the day, only social media is mainly well, directed to young people or people under 30. I think people over 30, in terms of percentages, not so many people spend a lot of time on this. Okay, so but they frame everything, and they frame the kind of conflict, they frame these kind of wars. For example, these categories, linguistic categories you were mentioning, pro, anti, in favor of, against. I mean, this is pretty much in the way you construct the narrative about what is going on in these kind of conflicts. Okay, so I think that would be also nice to I don't know, I'm sure you already do it in your project. Okay, but it would be nice to see what the fuck the media are doing with all this. Okay, because also the politicians, they pay so much attention to the media. They frame many things, policies according to whatever the media is doing. I think would be. I don't know whether you have been really looking at this in your research, but that is a very to what extent media is accountable for all these things, and which are the effects of the media, whatever framings they do on these issues. I don't know whether you have been also looking at this in your research, but if you can say something, would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So how we did it. So I am the PI in the project, so the postdocs did the interviews, and we are writing chapter 2 of the book at the moment by doing an interview with the 2 postdocs that did the bulk of the Irish and Canadian interviews. And what's fascinating about how they speak about doing it is the incongruence of what they expected maybe sometimes, or what other people expect. So how did you do research with these people? Well, these people are also your neighbors, they're also your friends, they're also probably maybe even sitting in this class. They're not these people that are strange others that like float around and we grab them in to do the research. They're living lives around you. But I think there was certainly jarring experiences. Both postdocs had extensive experience in doing various, I don't want to speak for them, but they had, they were really highly qualified people who had engaged in various ways in these kind of oppositions. Nevertheless, I think it can sometimes be really jarring when somebody says something like, we're chatting about cooking. And then they go, and this is what I think about abortion. And it's like, whoa, So, it's that kind of, you're getting on, and then they say something totally that, you wouldn't agree with, that they wouldn't say in other spaces. So you would just continue chatting about cookery or about the weather or about whatever. So, I think, as I say, there's a whole chapter. What I think is interesting is the process of the research. So, recruiting people was difficult. We were in the middle of COVID. We pivoted from in-person recruitment to online recruitment. We really struggled for about 6 to 8 months. And then we found Facebook, and Facebook recruitment was brilliant. Twitter recruitment was awful. Reddit wasn't great. We basically recruited heavily through Facebook. And contrary to what you're saying, Javier, it's because older people are on Facebook, apparently, not the younger people anymore. They're on Instagram or TikTok. So this is, I don't feel old, but apparently I've entered that category. So from there, we're dealing then with the reactions to the project. So some people saying, you shouldn't do these, you're speaking to all the wrong people, you're totally wrong, this is a hate organization, contacting the EU and saying you should defund these people, you know, look what they're doing, you know, that kind of reaction. And then the other reaction of, you know, these are just trying to catch you out, they're going to exploit you, you know, this kind of thing. So dealing with those comments and all that was really, really difficult. And then in the recruitment phase, what we asked people to do was we directed them through a questionnaire so they could see what the project was about. And that really was helpful during COVID, and it got us quite a few interviewees. And then you went into the interview, and they were all online, on Zoom. And there's both a kind of distance to that, in that they're not in, at least you're not sitting at a cafe, at least you're not trying to meet somebody you don't know. Equally, they're in your house, and you're in their house, and they can see behind you, and you can see behind them, and there's an intimacy to that that's can be really upsetting and disturbing. And then the transcription. The participants or the postdocs talked about the transcription as being really difficult, having to sit with the words for a much longer time, having to go back over them maybe 5 or 6 or 10 times to try and get them very accurate. And, you know, some of the hardest points having to do that because you really wanted to make sure that what they'd said you were really accurately recording. So you were spending a lot of time on the most difficult bits of the interviews. You know, things we don't think, you know, in a paper we write, and then we transcribed and coded them, you know, and actually we've got a whole section on what it means to transcribe these kinds of interviews, which we don't necessarily account for in methodologies or thinking about them. And ethical considerations were huge. So for doing the interviews, you know, they're straightforward interviews. We're going to ask people questions about sensitive, blah, 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 blah. But we wrote an ethos document. Maria will recognize this. We wrote an ethos document that was 2 or 3 pages, put it on the website. We had an extensive privacy policy. We had a lot that was about reassuring people about what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. Because, of course, as soon as they look me up, you know, my lesbian geographies book comes up, my livable lives, but like it's not a surprise where I stand on these issues. You know, I have a whole book on repeal and abortion. So, you know, like the fact that they were willing to trust us and to come into the room anyway. Now, some of them did come into the room and say, your PI is a total asshole. That's fine. I am sometimes, again, as Maria was saying. But getting them into the room was really difficult. So a lot of the ethical considerations were about getting them into the room. They were about pivoting to online interviews. And then, you know, realistically, it's just about protecting data. So we have like extensive protection. I can't even tell you about the data protection. It's that protected. You know, it's not online anywhere how you can get it. We have a special firewall only for our data. You know, like it's that kind of ethical considerations. And then the other ethical considerations, which is what I was saying about recording and publishing this, is we were really worried about being attacked. So we were worried about the researchers. I was worried about the researchers. I was worried about myself, I was worried about my family. We had the police come and visit my house to tell me how to improve security. You know, at the stage of 2018, 2019, you know, people were starting to come onto US campuses. It hadn't happened in the UK or Ireland yet, but I was very worried. And I was worried about what it might mean for people's reputations to be involved in this, especially if they were targeted. You know, I have a permanent job, but postdocs don't. What does it mean for them? You know, all that kind of thing. Was, I think, an ethical consideration as well, and continues to be. You know, we never know. Like, there hasn't been a reaction to this project. I like to think that we've fulfilled our pledge to be respectful and to engage with and to listen. People might disagree, but I think we have, and maybe that's why there isn't an opposition. You know, we haven't created a them and us, we've challenged the them and us, or maybe they're just waiting for the right moment. So just Yes, absolutely. The narrative approach for government. What I would say is during the, and thank you for your extensive question, it's brilliant. So during research that I did in the early 2000s, again, I don't feel old, but that's 2 decades ago, we did a lot of work with the local council in Brighton around LGBT lives. And what I found was really effective for changing policies' minds. So in Brighton, it's supposedly the gay city of the UK. Everything's great. The gay people are happy. And we were like doing work that was like, so some gay people are happy, and then we have homelessness, and we have an issue around young people, and we have an issue around older people, and we have, you know, and we were trying to say, here are all the things you need to focus on to make things better. And so in order to do that, what really worked, and I would encourage everybody to do that, is the stories alongside the stats. So we had both a kind of statistical collection of, you know, the level of homelessness amongst LGBT populations is hugely higher than it is for the general population, which of course includes LGBT people as well. But it's significantly higher. Something like 60% across their lifetimes of people will experience some form of homelessness, including kind of sofa surfing. So it was, you know, and the general population is around 20%. You know, it was like that kind of statistical difference. And then a story. What was it like for that person? And that's very hard to ignore. And it's very hard not to take on board. So I would encourage that kind of narrative approach to policy making, and particularly when you're dealing with marginalised communities, because I think it shows what it means. And I think, you know, we're in the middle of this, and I don't know about what it's like in Spain, but certainly in the UK, increasingly in Ireland, you know, this kind of anti-transgender critical, you know, challenge to people's rights. And what we don't hear is stories. So we hear stats a lot, but actually the stories are really powerful of people's lives.
But policymakers in Brighton, you say Brighton?
In Brighton, that was, yeah.
LGBT people are more happier in Brighton than in whatever other city?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, well, that's what they like to think.
Have you data on this?
Yeah, so I've got a book called Ordinary in Brighton, which talks about this. So Brighton is seen as this kind of gay haven, this gay city in the UK, but actually there was also, and it is, and for lots of people they have lovely lives in Brighton and it's amazing, and for other people there's mental health things, so their services were very orientated towards a very particular straight person, so like homelessness services, now it's all been cut since, but at the time they had an LGBT officer, for mental health they were supporting an LGBT mental health group, you know, so specific services that were catering for that population that require specific input.
This is a consequence of all these research combining narrative stories with...
So, I mean, I'm not going to take the full credit for it now. It's research plus activism plus what I would say open doors, so policymakers were willing to listen. And, you know, there's some doors that are definitely open, and in Brighton at that time it was the new Labour government. They wanted to do what they called evidence-based practice. They said things like, if you give us the evidence, we will make change. And that requires policymakers who are willing to use evidence to make change. Whereas the Tories, you know, they got Brexit through on the basis of, we've had enough of the experts. It's a very different scenario. I don't know that we would get the same response now. There's no money either. You know, Britain are struggling.
We do not have these things in Spain, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, you see, that's because you don't have enough narrative research. That's what I'm hearing. And I agree that social polarization, I think what we haven't done enough around social polarization is explore, and this is something that I'd like to do in the next project, hopefully, is explore peace studies and how peace studies deal with conflict in complex areas and how that might be applied or not, or in kind of these more social issues that we don't see as conflict regions. So what are the ways that we don't negate power relations and we create living together? Like peace studies knows a lot about this. They know a lot about conflict resolution. But the problem, my understanding of peace studies, which is limited, is that, you know, it doesn't necessarily look at sexuality or gender in a huge way. There is some more on gender than there is on sexuality. And it obviously only focuses on areas of kind of war and physical conflict. But what if we were to think about opposition in terms of conflict, and how would that work?
But to solve the problem of polarization process, you need to know quite well both
exactly.
sides. Otherwise, it's not
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
most of the times public policies, they attend only one side, which is very stupid, because I mean, you only have to do some policy to, well, to basically do the other side, no?
Yeah.
Otherwise they will never change their mind about something that could be actually very stupid.
And not even that. So what I was going to say about your policy question is anyone who's doing public policy in this area will know very well what it is like, both to have these kind of experiences of marginalisation, but also to be experiencing attacks. I think at the moment you can't be in the arena, again, I don't know the Spanish context, but in the arena of gender and sexuality and not have, you know, people contacting you saying, or equality, diversity and inclusion even, and not have people contacting you saying you're woke, you know, you're not paying attention to the real people, you know, all this kind of thing. And I think there's something about getting beyond those discourses to see what the experiences are, to see if there, you know, is there something there? Is there something there that we need to consider? And so there, I think research, I would say, is key, but it's not talking to people as if they're on the same level. You know, we need to amplify marginalised voices because they're the ones who need better policies, and we need to understand other voices in order to really get to grips with this opposition. But I'm really concerned about the idea of a false equivalence, or that the power doesn't matter. You know, power does matter, and these experiences tell us something that we don't know, and something that might change our mind in how we create policy. So my recommendation is to listen beyond the attacks. So there will be the attacks, but if you can get to people who have the experiences of, say it's a workplace, or if it's at national level, you know, what are the experiences that people are having around these things? Is that something, as I said, is that something that we care about, or is it okay that they're experiencing this? You know, some might argue it's okay. It's okay that somebody goes to prison for writing those tweets, or it's okay. I don't think anyone would agree that their family should be attacked, like, you know, in a civilized society, but I think they might think, yeah, it's perfectly fine. But we need to understand what the experiences are before we can make that judgment call. And we need to ask the question. So we don't, at policy level, ask the question: is the consequences are the consequences of this okay? But you're right. In order to know what the consequences are, we have to have the research. So yeah. And yes, I think the media are key. In fact, in Ireland, it's fascinating because there isn't a huge gender critical movement at the moment. But in the media, it's starting to happen, and that's where you get the barometer of what's coming next, because the media, the politicians, how these things are reacted to. And speaking beyond the media is another key thing. So one of the things I would say to policymakers or to LGBT groups or organisations is sometimes quiet activism makes a huge difference. Going and allowing people to ask questions, to get it wrong, to say the wrong thing, to use the wrong words, and just talking to them and not attacking, not saying you're bigoted. You know, that kind of level of activism is also important alongside the protests. I guess what I find more difficult is the targeting of individuals. I'm not sure that the targeting of individuals, especially individuals who are not in the public sphere by their own volition, I'm not sure of the value of that. But other people might tell me that's hugely valuable. We need to name the bad people. I don't know. Like, I can see how arguments would happen. But yes, absolutely. I think the media is crucial. I think what's interesting again in Ireland, I don't know if this is happening here, but RTE, which is the main state broadcaster, talks about when they now go to cover any protests, they're told, oh, they're the mainstream media, they won't report it properly anyway, what would they know, they're biased. So there's this rejection of the media in all kinds of circles in favour of social media, or in favour of these in-group circles. That's, again, I'm not a media scholar, but I think that that's really, really been key for how the media is perceived in a kind of Trump. I was hoping we were post-Trump, but we appear to still be in a Trump era. So yes, yeah, exactly.
The last 3 minutes, we have one question. Thanks.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Cristina from Maria's team
Yeah.
too. Thank you very much. I think it's really, really interesting and opens a lot of questions and of lines of thinking. I was wondering if there are differences between how people share their views in the interviews and how they share it in the groups. Because, well, if it's some kind of way of
Yeah.
understanding the other or not in these collective spaces that you create.
Yeah, no problem. So in the interviews, we spoke to them about their everyday lives, and in the groups, we spoke to them about how they might live together. So they were slightly different focus. So, you know, we told people, we made them promise, and the recruitment for it was extensive, as you can imagine. We were bringing people into a room that fundamentally disagreed, and anything could happen. That was really terrifying. In the focus groups, despite us saying, you know, you can't convince, you're not going to convince anyone else in this room. We're just going to pretend for the next day that you will hold your positions. It didn't matter. Participants don't always listen. So there were still arguments and discussions about their positions. Obviously, we redirected as soon as we could, but you know, you do also have to let people. And there it became less personal. It became about the talking points. So it wasn't, for me, I was really interested in people's lives, because I can read why they think, why gender critical people think women's spaces are. I can read that. You know, I know the talking points, and I do read them all the time. But the lives, you don't hear. You don't hear what it means, and you don't hear about it. And similarly in the focus groups, it was like, that's not interesting. Yes, you can have that debate. It's the same debate that they'll have on social media, they'll have in other places. Let's go past that to think about, okay, so you're going to hold these positions, now what? Neither of you are going to move. You know, what's going to happen? And you know, when I was talking about this research, somebody once said jokingly to me, sure, we'll just throw them in the sea. And I said, mass genocide is a bad idea. And, you know, there isn't an answer to the question. You know, if we fundamentally disagree on these issues, how do we live together? And how do we think beyond the structures we've been given of policing and of particular kind of governance? How can we think an other world that is not just our ideal, not just our utopia? And that is a question I don't have an answer for, but I think is a question we need to ponder. So yeah.
I have to close. Thank you so much for for your time. Thank you for coming here, for engaging in the debate, and
thank you all.
We will follow your advancement and the finding of this research.